Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Blox Populi, Blockchain of the People. I'm your host, Brandon Lovejoy, and today we're joined by a very special guest, Will Ruddick. Will is a development economist focusing on currency innovation. He's a graduate in high energy physics and a collaboration member at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. Will has pioneered community currency programs in Kenya since 2010 and is the founder of the award-winning Sarafu and Bangla-Pesa programs, as well as the founder of Grassroots Economics, and he currently consults on community currencies worldwide. Will, hello. How are you doing today?
Hey, Brendan. Good to be here. I'm doing okay. Yeah.
Glad to have you. So you're currently located in Kenya, and you've been there that's home now.
Yeah, almost 13 years here, and I'm in Kilifi, which is just a beautiful little town north of Mombasa on the coast. Yeah.
Nice. I've long wanted to visit, so someday maybe we could do this in person sometime.
For sure. I think everyone should move here. That's one of my goals in life, to get more people to come.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
I'm taking suggestions given the state of the world. Like, I'm open.
Definitely, no question.
Well, cool. Let's dive in a little bit and see if I can tease out of you some of your background and a little bit of the story of how you got into community currencies and like what led you here from physics and all that. If you could give us a little rundown.
Yeah, I mean, I'd always been an activist. I grew up in California in Santa Cruz, and I had done sort of different sort of tranches, and I was running what was called the Spiritual Emergency Network for a while in Santa Cruz, and in the physics, getting into physics was kind of a way for me to sort of rebel against all the new age stuff that I grew up around and try to what is energy and all this kind of stuff. And I ended up doing a PhD on pentaquarks, which are 5 quark systems. And I proved that they didn't exist. And I was kind of disappointed. And I was doing a conference where I had sort of organized. As a grad student, you end up doing a lot of this kind of work, organizing conferences and things. And it was the conference for the next linear collider that was going to be built. Mm-hmm. And there was this one point where I'm sitting through this conference, and it's a lot of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. I've got a very talkative cat, by the way.
So not too loud.
No, okay, good. And all of these, mostly grown men with distinguished careers, and some of them Nobel Prizes and whatnot, vehemently fighting over funding with each other. And it was around that time I had started reading some of the works by like Bernard Leotar, like The Future of Money, and I had started even getting into what was called econophysics back then, which was basically using agent-based models to simulate small economies and look at what kind of rules could be tweaked. And I felt like there was this sort of ridiculous situation of us as a species sort of not really consciously being aware of what the economic system we lived in was built for or designed for or just had evolved into, and we're just locked into it every day. And I mean, it seemed like the elephant in the room, and that was kind of my point of exiting from physics and getting into economics. And I spent the next several years studying community currencies and visiting them all over the world and all over the US as well. And I was just really inspired by the concept and even the history of them. There's just a really rich history. I mean, going back from, like the Silk Road and these, early, original, these Asian paper notes that were traded along the Silk Road that were backed by local merchants and things like this. And that evolving into the banking systems in Italy and whatnot. There's just this really rich history of how currencies have evolved and been used during depression eras. And in the US and in Austria, and a lot of, just amazing history that I think we just don't, it's there in a few books here and there, but it's definitely not in mainstream education at all. And we've kind of forgot as a species, what even, currency design is. We just kind of take for granted that we've got this one. And then, around 2007 is when I joined the Peace Corps, which is a volunteer organization. And I just, after having studied currencies for a while and working with a lot of different nonprofit organizations, I really wanted to be and work in a place where I felt useful, and that I, and to me, being in the U.S. was a place where, at least where I was, people were very sort of like, everyone had a lawn and a sofa and watched TV all the time, and I didn't feel like I could be useful there. And anyway, so the Peace Corps was a way for me to sort of also escape from the U.S. I felt really liberated having escaped from that culture, and so I started doing community currency programs after learning Swahili here, and the entry was basically to take a lot of these models that I had seen, like Berkshire's in Massachusetts, for instance, and Bancos Palomas and Curitiba in Brazil, and show those videos to people living in informal sectors here or in slums, and just ask them what they thought, and kind of co-design something like those. And so that was sort of the first one I did, was back in 2010, I guess. That was called Ecopesa, and yeah, it was just a process where I sort of there was a local NGO that gave me an intern to help, and she knew some of the people in this one area where her parents lived, and it was an informal settlement near Mombasa, and we just started having conversations with the town elders and the chief, and then businesses, and hosting little workshops and showing them videos of, here's an example in Brazil, here's another example in the US, how would this work here? What would you guys do? And does this seem useful? And just, slow kind of co-designing processes. And eventually we designed and printed a bunch of paper notes with different denominations, kind of security printing, so that it wasn't easy to copy them. And we took pictures of the local area, and the businesses in this case, they all got a certain amount to start with, just to sort of backed by their own goods and services, very small amount, like 50 cents on the dollar of these vouchers. And then we had a lump sum of money that I got from friends and family, and that was sort of the backing of these vouchers, right? So we had a reserve. It was a full reserve system in this case. And to me, that was sort of the safest way to try this. And what happened was that the businesses would come together as a group, and they would organize community events, like waste collection events mostly. We did some tree planting as well. And mostly it was getting rid of like stagnant water that was like collecting, where mosquitoes would lay their eggs and there'd be malaria and all that stuff. So it was like getting that stuff out. And we brought in these the county trucks that sort of never come there because it's quite hard to actually get the collection done, because it's all like between houses and stuff. And so the businesses collected all these people together and said, hey, let's do this thing together. And we paid them in these vouchers, which we called Ecopesa at the time, and they could use those at the businesses that sort of organized the event. And then the businesses every month could basically cash out a small amount, like $5 worth every month. And so we kept doing those events until all the money was eventually cashed out, right? And basically I had back all of the vouchers, and that was the end of the program. That was the trial. And it worked really well. There was actually quite a few groups that just kept using the vouchers over and over, and I never wanted to cash them out some small amount, just because they got into that pattern with each other of that reciprocal trade. And that was, we had some other grad students coming in trying to track, with like spending books, like serial numbers and things like this. And we did the best we could in terms of measuring that, that sort of secondary circulation. And it was just, yeah, it was really, it was gratifying to see that was effective. I mean, in terms of like the cost of doing that program as well, like if we had just gone in and paid people for it, it would have costed something like 5x what we actually did. So it was just a nice way for a community to do something like that. And then the next program I did was called Bangla-Pesa, and in that case, the idea was to do it without the backing, without the one-to-one backing, and say, well, can the business community issue these themselves, right? So instead of it having a reserve behind it, a tangible, the reserve was their goods and services. So much more of like an actual voucher. Yeah, I mean, all kinds of things. But I in terms of like kind of going back to like the motivation and why this was so exciting to me, again, it was just the idea that we could choose, or humans could choose to have a different economic system, that they could, redesign who gets to issue a currency. And to me, that there's this piece around projecting into the future what we want to value. And if I, want to value my future work, or let's say I'm a student and I want to value my future production after I get this education, well, who says I can't create a credit against that future value, and who says I can? So like answering that question of who allows credit to be created, how do you create trusted systems, and once you have these sort of trusted credit systems, what enables them to start flowing and become currencies? And maybe just to sort of gloss over this period with the Bangla-Pesa, and post Bangla-Pesa, we did many other programs. I think in the end we did 11, and at that time we had started Grassroots Economics, and so we was me and a few Kenyans like Carolyn Dama and Ruth Mwangi, and that started an organization that says, okay, well, this seems useful enough, right? Like if we can even just multiply the effectiveness of the aid that's happening in Kenya, because the aid from a lot of people's point of view has been terribly ineffective, right? Like it really hasn't created any sort of resilience. It's more of like, created a lot of chronic dependency without any sort of, systematic change in economic systems or industries or anything like that. So if this was on that path, it seemed worth doing, and to just be as radically transparent as we can be, and share failures and best practices and all this kind of stuff. And so it wasn't until like I think the first time we started playing around with a digital interface was in 2015, and we just kind of prototyped a lot of stuff using USSD, which is a unstructured supplementary service data. So this is like it's a layer kind of below SMS, where you can actually pop up little menus, like text menus, on any phone that doesn't need internet. And so we created a front end using that would allow you to send, check your balance, and have like profile information, like what are you selling, a basic little directory system. And then in 2017, we started actually using that, but it was still very expensive at that point. Like the telecoms, or Safaricom specifically, was charging like 10 cents per session, 10 cents like on the US dollar. And it was just way too expensive to use. And it wasn't until like 2018 that it dropped down to about 1 cent on the dollar to use it. And Kenya is still one of the cheapest places in the world to do this. Most countries are still at 10 cents a dollar or more sometimes. It's crazy. Yeah, I mean, basically we converted anyone's paper tokens into a voucher, or a digital voucher in this case. We ran this for a while we were on a back-end database, and then we switched over to the POA blockchain. There was the original kind of POA. It was before XDAI existed. And there was a POA token, which was the gas token, and it was super, super cheap. And basically, they just gave us a whole bunch for free to run this on there. But yeah, I don't know. I keep talking forever. Ooh.
No, it's great. Yeah, so you've now I'm hearing myself come back to myself again. Let's see. Oh, it stopped. Good. Yeah, so you've gone from paper vouchers and now to digital using USSD, which I'd like to hear a little bit more about at some point. And then kind of ended up bringing that to like a blockchain backend, essentially, to provide that the data structure.
Yeah.
What I'm curious though, before we get into blockchain and all the high tech stuff, what are your main takeaways from using paper vouchers, like the benefits and the problems of that in relatively undeveloped quote unquote communities around the world, such as what you've experienced with the Bangla-Pesa? What has that
Yeah.
taught you?
Paper was great in some ways, right? There's no transaction fee to hand one to another person, right? It's totally, anonymous, like there's no middlemen sort of in the way. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of local identity. People understand it very instantaneously. Like, I've got this voucher and it says this is for Bangla-Pesa, and there's this group of businesses around here with little signs on their shop saying that they accept it, right? It's their voucher. It was very clear that they were issuing a token against their production. In this case, a bill or a voucher. Yeah, it was great fun. I loved it. I mean, there was a lot of issues. I mean, the Kenyan government took us to jail. That wasn't fun. For printing these, so there was a lot of like, what is this? Some kind of like secessionist terrorist plot and things like that. So there, people were kind of got up in arms around the printed bills, especially when Bangla-Pesa started. It was a big fuss.
And how did that resolve?
Yeah,
Favorably for Bangla-Pesa and you, I presume, in
yeah,
some
yeah.
sense.
You have to check out my YouTube. I wrote a song about it. Did you?
We could play it on the outro, maybe.
Yeah, sure. Well, we eventually did a petition to the director of public prosecution, and we basically went to court for 6 months after getting being able to pay bail and getting out of jail, and it's really, really hard for a government to stop a woman from paying her school fees in tomatoes, right? Especially in areas where they have no currency, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a really big concept right now, where is there anything like economic liberty as a human right in any way? Like, am I allowed to trade my production or future production for other future production? Right? Like, basically, like there's a huge crackdown on even the concept of credit. So if I do something nice for you, Brandon, or whatever, and then you do something nice for me, does the government need a cut of that? Right? And what's the ledger in that case? Our memory. What's the point at which reciprocity is made illegal? And that's kind of what the government was saying. Oh no, you can't have reciprocal relationships with each other, especially if you're going to record it with a piece of paper somehow. So that was super intense. But in the end, they found that it was quite embarrassing. We got a lot of press around that time, and a lot of people coming out to say, "How dare you? Like, why would you stop these people from trading with each other when they don't have the money that you're the one supposed to be providing liquidity for, right? Like, that's sort of the role of the central bank and whatnot." And so yeah, it was pretty intense and contentious, and I mean, still, where we are right now. I mean, Bitcoin was just starting around like 2007, 2008, and at that time, I was very much like, well, how about a token issuance model where people and businesses and communities issue tokens, right? Like, and that was, going back to this whole, huge history of how money came about in the first place, right? Instead of these sort of, there's a lot of utility in some ways to Bitcoin and these other sort of gas tokens that basically secure the ledgers and things like this. But I mean, like, is there the ability for, like, that's wonderful. Like, can also this woman selling tomatoes make a token, right? And when is that going to be legal or illegal? And to me, these are sort of the ultimate utility tokens, right? They're actually for real stuff, you know? So I think that the legal discourse around community currencies and these voucher or tradable vouchers has kind of been ignored. You know, like, people don't really think of it in connection to the cryptocurrency space, but actually that's sort of the heart of it, right? Who gets to create a token or that they decide is valuable and trade it with each other, right? And can governments say, no, you can only do that in our currency, which is ultimately inhuman and ridiculous, right? It's really it's like a totalitarian system that we've all sort of just been okay with for a long time because we grew up in it. We just don't even question it, and we're just starting to question it now. And so that's what's been wonderful about the whole, blockchain kind of revolution happening in the last few years.
What would you say to people that looked at these vouchers being transacted between people and saw that no taxes were being paid on those transactions and felt like that was like a run, you're running around the spirit of this, what taxes are supposed to be in their ideal sense,
Well, I mean, we were dealing in Kenya, like, less than 30% of the population pays any tax. It's all informal sector, especially the people we're working with, right? These are really marginalized communities that really have never paid taxes their entire life, right? I mean, what we're doing right now in terms of smart contracts is that we have taxation included into it, right? And we're actually starting to work with local governments on accepting that as a tax. So, for instance, if you're creating a Lovejoy token and it's backed by your delicious bread, and you're saying 50 of these is equal to a loaf, right? Well, and you give some to me, if there's a holding tax on that, so we do what's it's similar to like an expiration date, but it's a gradual expiration, right? So over time, let's say I'm holding 100 Lovejoys, and at the end of each month, one of those Lovejoys goes back to you, right? It's expiring, slowly over time. Well, instead of it just going back to you, it could also go to the local government, right? Or it could go to, we're working a lot with community groups on them deciding where they would like their taxes to go and even voting on that type of situation. But in our pilots right now, getting started in Kitui, that's going to local village administrators. And their job is to make sure that you maintain your peg, right? You're pegged it to bread, right? These were your vouchers. You've spent them into circulation somehow, right? Or people bought them with their goods and services, or even national currency in some case. So you maintaining it's like, if you've got a voucher for, the Spar or Safeway or whatever, Whole Foods or something like this. If Whole Foods stops accepting that voucher, there should be legal action in that case. And we're actively working with a lot of like legal firms around defining that peg really quite clearly, right? And so what's beautiful in like in a lot of the crypto space is that like Ethereum, for instance, is an algorithmic peg against block validation, right? It's necessarily useful for one thing, right? We're also doing this hackathon right now with mesh networks, and we're using Althea around that. So you create a token that's necessarily useful against bandwidth, right? You can buy, internet bundles with it. So algorithmic pegs are beautiful in that sense, right? Because they don't require this sort of legal contract. But on the other side, if you want a voucher that's against the vegetables in this farm, and you want to allow communities to create those structures, then you need some sort of legal peg behind it. So really, that's a lot of the experimentation we've been doing is in illegally pegging or socially pegging, and creating systems like of guarantors and collective enforcement. So sort of thinking of it as more like a commons, right? How do you manage that commons together?
Awesome, great answer. I want to get into grassroots economics and your work there now, which you've kind of talked a little bit about, but you hit a buzzword that I can't leave alone, which is, and I know you mentioned earlier, which is mesh networks. Um,
Sure.
it's a really exciting concept, and I'm curious where you guys are at. You told me earlier that you're doing a hackathon around mesh networks, and
Yeah.
maybe you could say a little bit about what you think of that in practice, and like how it can be incentivized, as you say, with bandwidth and tokens.
Yeah. I'm super excited about it, and so we're still doing a lot of design process. We've got David Johnson from University of Cape Town, who's sort of a pioneer in mesh networks. He's been building this thing called Ineti, which is like how people can create offline content and mesh it amongst each other. And you can still have internet coming in as well, but you have all this kind of tons of different types of offline content, and people can be incentivized to add offline content, right? So you can have local radio stations, you could have local all kinds of art or educational materials, and like during COVID they've been starting to use a lot of this stuff, and so there's two pieces of it. One is working with local ISPs, like internet service providers, and explaining to this just the way we work with communities and saying, hey, why don't you guys make a voucher, a digital voucher against bandwidth? So, just understanding that concept for an ISP and saying, okay, well, why would we do that? Well, one, you're creating a voucher against future production. So it's sort of like a pre-sale, right? The same way as like, if you were making a voucher against your future bread, Lovejoy's bread, if you can pre-sell that bread, it's generally a good thing for a business, right?
Yeah.
But specifically on their case, it's like most of these ISPs are doing subscription services that aren't really applicable to a lot of the population. But if you can say, if you've got 50 of my ISP token, you can get a daily bundle that's worth 1 GB, gigabytes for that day. And so it makes sense to tokenize some of these things because it makes it more fungible, more usable, and there can be secondary circulation of them. And there's this whole benefit of blockchain that we haven't really gotten into yet, is that once you have a voucher, that's trusted and good for your goods and services, and it's got that peg, if it's on a blockchain, especially if that blockchain can be bridged to other blockchains, you can do all kinds of really cool stuff. So getting into things like liquidity pools, like connecting it to other tokens, right? So you can have one token connected to another, and you end up with these sort of connected membranes that overlap. And then you can build a whole economy around that. So that's been really our vision for a long time. I wanted to see this sort of ecosystem of connected value systems together that could operate without sort of one monopolistic, currency, right? Like how can we create, collaborative systems of, this commons connected to that commons, connected to this one, connected to that one. And that was, the beauty of blockchain. I got really, what really pulled me the most into blockchain was these membranes. And sort of the first organization that I knew about doing this stuff was Bancor. And what they had done is they created these equations that would connect tokens together, right? This was like the early version of the liquidity pool.
Yeah, the AMM.
Yeah, the automated market makers. Yes, exactly. And so that was just really exciting. It's like, oh, okay, great. Because what we had in the past was a dude standing on the street with one currency in his pocket and another currency in his other pocket. He's a liquidity provider, and the algorithm is him charging some fee between those two. So I've got shillings and euros or something like this, right? Or I've got one community currency and another community currency, right? That's a liquidity provider. And that's his investment, that money in the two, or it's his boss's investment or whatever, right? Like you've got... and so all of a sudden you say, well, take that guy completely out of the picture and make that just like a fundamental, prototype contract, right? That anyone can add to that, become a liquidity provider and have some stake, in that pool. And so that was a really awesome concept that you could now invest into the connection between two different value systems. Like that's a really cool concept. Granted, like most, like you've got this huge DeFi space right now that like Uniswap, for instance, that basically said you can connect any two tokens together and we'll route them all through each other too, right? So if token A and B are connected and B and C, well then A and C are also connected, and you can, have all this pathing and stuff. So yeah, I like that space And those concepts to me are still like the primitives I basically think about in this whole connection between currencies that can be continuous. You can have continuous liquidity rather than having like the money changer on the side of the road. Eventually, if there's too much on this side and he empties out his, the pocket on the other side, well, he just stops functioning at that point, right? Like until someone comes back and puts money on the other side. That's what I could call like a static liquidity pool, right?
Okay.
So a money changer on the side of the road, it has a static rate, and and eventually it might empty on one side or on the other. That's okay, actually, in some situations. You can make an algorithmic version of that, which is quite useful. Like, let's say between two villages, they don't want to have a fluctuating rate at all. They want 1-to-1. And yeah, it's going to empty out at some point, and then politically they're going to come say, oh, it's time to go back this way. That can actually be a beautiful thing. But when you have things like, you're connecting a token to something that's like outside of a trusted realm, like out to the US dollar or something like that, let the market adjust those rates, right? There's no one to say what that rate should be. So I think these, these sort of basic concepts, of liquidity pools, that's one of those sort of kernels that I've really, really, just enjoyed from the blockchain space, and just applying that to actual real utility tokens that are good for goods and services has been just a big eye opener. So back to the ISPs. So for an ISP to do this and say, look, I'm going to create a token against my future production, just like we would do in a village. Well, if I can connect that token to a liquidity pool, so let's say I come in and I buy $500 of those tokens, right? I say, okay, I want some of those. So first off, I've supported that ISP, and I'm going to put that into a pool. So I've got these ISP tokens along with, let's say, 500 DAI, or a US dollar stable coin or whatever it is. So now I got a pool with $500 of these tokens and $500 of USDC. If someone wants to now, they can now come in and buy some of those ISP tokens on this pool, right? And if a whole bunch of people have been cashing out their ISP tokens, it's going to drop their value, right, against the dollar. And now someone can cheaply come in and push their dollar in there, right? So you're creating a membrane that connects them to dollars, for instance. It doesn't have to be dollars, but now imagine instead of connecting it to dollars, you connect it to like a network token that is supporting like a curation token that supports ISPs in general. So you've got like, let's call that like token Y, right? So token Y then does that connection with another ISP and another ISP and another ISP. So all the ISPs now in Kenya can be convertible to each other through your network token, right? And so you create an entire market where, like, if ISP A wants to jack up their price, well, people can now convert from token A to token D with another ISP. So it really helps these markets become a lot more fair and transparent. And someone can come in there and say, oh, I want to support this token Y, which is really a portfolio token now, right? It represents all these other tokens. So you have a lot of capabilities to sort of create this like curated spaces around value systems, right? And so let's say you do that for vegan restaurants. Let's say you do it for, you're UNICEF and you want to support youth-run organizations, that are doing stuff. Wonderful, great. So like UNICEF is doing a Yoma token, which is like this youth marketplace token. And we're piloting that exact same concept. So, right, like imagine there's youth groups all across Kenya. They create their own tokens against what they're doing in their communities. These are like young adults, like they're doing things like waste collection or healthcare services or health volunteers and things like that, right? You want to support those. Wonderful. Well, what you do is you curate a whole bunch of those tokens. You look at, also the data coming off of these tokens is a huge thing. And this gets into the whole NFT space and impact claims, where you say, look, we are seeing so like, for instance, last year with Sarafu, we've seen over $3 million worth of trade among categories of health, of, food, water, energy, waste collection, environmental services, right? And if you look at all that space and you say, well, okay, these represent sustainable development goals. These represent, even in some cases, they represent carbon offsetting or carbon sequestration and things like that. Well, that's all really valuable stuff that lots of people and organizations and impact investors want to support. So if you can take those as validated claims, right, and come up with systems where you say, okay, yeah, Brandon, you did, X, Y, and Z. It's been endorsed, by such and such. There's this, evaluation of that. Someone comes in there and supports it. They get an NFT for having supported it, right?
Mm.
And it being, just a signed impact claim or data bundle that's sitting there on a blockchain. We're starting to work a lot with IXO around this. They've got some really nice schemas around these things. They call them impact claims. Yeah.
So much.
Yeah,
You're like like pull a thread, and it's the whole ball unwinds. It's great. I love it. You've been thinking about this for a really long time, and everything kind of like merges into everything else. You start talking about mesh nets, and pretty soon we're in tokenized vouchers, and the whole impact claims are a really interesting concept. Whew.
Yeah. I mean, back to the mesh networks just for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's two parts again to it. There's the really cool stuff around this offline content, and then you have ISPs coming in with their internet, right? So there's two parts of the mesh network. One is just having the mesh of offline content to offline content, and people being able to curate and add. That can have its own token around it, right? That people can say, oh, look, within this mesh network, Brandon gets these tokens for uploading his content, right? He, as people download the content, they can pay for it in that token, right? So you can have an economies around that. So you can also have freemium, like a certain amount of it's free, but if you're going to be consuming, let's say, huge bandwidth, even, in the mesh network, right, you can throttle that in the same way that you kind of use a gas token to basically make sure there's not, attacks on the network. Yeah.
So with the mesh network, I don't, maybe to be clear about like the topology of the mesh network that we're talking about, does it rely on ISPs, or can there be like sort of a peer-to-peer, like I'm hosting content for the neighborhood or something?
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to have ISPs involved at all. You don't.
Okay.
No. Yeah. And we're sort of this hackathon has been really like going through the Althea stack, Althea.network, and they've got it kind of keyed in for like they're using DAI, for instance, as their sort of network token, and so we've been sort of ripping that out and saying no, let the community make their own token. I mean, we did the same thing with the Bancor stuff. They had like BNT as a network token. We said, well, why? I mean, that was their profit model, but
yeah.
And so there's a lot of that space, and like what we've been doing as Grassroots Economics Foundation is kind of trying to think of it as, in a way, like Linux Foundation, like who is out there holding the kernel, who, in other words, like there's all sorts of, there's Red Hat and Ubuntu and all these guys consuming, this open source code from Linux Foundation, right? And it's very valuable for someone for that not to be IP driven or owned by some particular company, right? Because then you end up with a whole space that is built around that. And there's a lot of open source code now in the blockchain space, but there's very little I find that is sort of blockchain agnostic, that's meant to basically be pluggable and accessible to the kind of last mile and things like that. So that we've had to redesign and redevelop from scratch a lot of tech. Even in the early days, we were using the Bancor wallet, and that ended up being proprietary. We had to fully redesign and redevelop all that stuff, and so we're still in that process. Still a lot a ways to go, but things are starting to take shape, and it's starting to be cogent to organizations or groups like the Cosmos Network, that there needs to be some holding of that space around value creation and community currency and connections and things like this. And they're starting to even build a lot of this stuff into like the Cosmos SDK, for instance. So if you're building a blockchain on Cosmos, you can automatically start using some of these tools.
Cool. Yeah, I really appreciate your blockchain agnostic, toolkit agnostic approach to things. It's kind of finding what works and making use of it. And I think that must be informed by like a very pragmatic approach that you've almost certainly had to adopt, like working in Kenya and other places where you just have to make use of the tools that you have access to and make them work for you, starting with paper, and then USSD like on mobile phones and so forth. So yeah, it's really inspiring to see that approach. Well, I think a lot of people in blockchain are so fixated on the tools that they've oftentimes forgotten why the tools even exist, and then they're wrapped up in capital gains and all this other secondary, tertiary stuff to the value that's actually needing to be created or transacted.
Yeah,
So.
I mean, the whole point of sort of like Web3 and blockchain to me is around, like this vision of like the proper Facebook, right? Where content providers, which is all the users, have a share of the platform, right? Like, isn't that the whole concept? And to some degree, I feel like it just sort of goes into that mode. And yet a lot of the blockchain space, I mean, it has been captured and hedged, so like, for instance, like the supply of Bitcoin, right? It's not some utopian system where like it's somehow been dispersed to everyone who needs it in the world. Of course not, right? There's good things and bad things about it, but a lot of these systems, like, even like a lot of the modern like proof of stake stuff, it's like, well, you're basically rewarding the early adopters who have a lot of these stake tokens or can buy them, right? Not everyone can be part of that, right? It's never going to be open to everyone. They're going to, and maybe that's fine for very specific like application stuff, right? You say, okay, great. These guys like IXO has built an amazing marketplace around impact claims. And yes, like the early adopters and whatnot are the stakeholders in that space, but they're not expecting the entire world to need to be that way. Instead, people can create their own small blockchains that do their own thing, right? Like El Salvador could have easily created their own blockchain. I mean, there's no reason they couldn't, and even smaller communities can do that as well. And then this protocol layers where they can be connected to each other, like through Polkadot or Cosmos protocol. There's all kinds of stuff around the connections between those. So I think like there's a push toward, enabling people to be part of the systems that they are using, right? And being a co-owner, right? Like I've done quite a bit of work with in Hong Kong, and there's these massive high rises there, and there's thousands of families living in there for generations, and the owner of them made their investment times 1,000 already, and generally that owner is like 3 generations ago, and you've got just like families of owners, and it never changes. And so when do those people get some stake? When do the actual people living in those apartments get some stake? And that's why that's what should be intolerable into the future, right? We shouldn't allow systems like that. And why would you allow a system even with like Bitcoin? Like, imagine your government starts charging you taxes in Bitcoin and forces you to use it, yet you have no stake. You can't run a node, and all the tokens were mined early by 5 dudes in fucking California, right? Like like these systems, like, so the Web3 stuff, of like people having stake in their own systems that they're part of and not being subject to rent seeking, right, forever, which is a form of slavery. Like, we're just slowly, like it's there, we're processing it, but at the same time, dudes need to get to the moon and make some dough, like the Bitcoin bros and stuff, where's my fucking laser eyes right now? It's just, there's so much of that in the space that just makes me want to vomit constantly. Like, it's so toxic, honestly. Like, even at Twitter and Telegram and stuff like that, you're just constantly like, oh, please, no, not another Bitcoin bro with laser eyes. Oh, I can't handle it, But I love you guys. Just,
Yeah. Well,
let other people do it too. Let other people have their own little versions of laser eyes. Come on, Jesus.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. But before I just go down that hole, so where do you think? Okay, you touched on some really interesting topics there, and one that stood out to me was like collective ownership, earning stake from your participation in a system. And recently we've seen the DAO, or the DAC, more frequently referred to as the DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization, um, coming sort of into the fore with, in Wyoming, even in the US now, we have, there's a DAO LLC. So there's the first legal structure around this DAO concept. And then I happened to catch a presentation on our cooperatives, the original DAO, with two ladies making the case that cooperatives are in fact actually a more flexible legal structure for the DAO and so forth. I see a lot of hunger for this sort of structuring our financial and economic relationships in terms of collective ownership. Where do you see this going, and how do how does Grassroots Economics, your organization, kind of think about that internally?
The DAO process for us, I mean, we haven't actually formalized any of our stuff into like a contractual DAO on a blockchain yet. I mean, we're hoping that happens by the end of this year. Right now, we actually use paper contracts, right? Like we work on the community. What does it say? It's a basic, like your constitution, your contract, who signs it physically. So to give you an idea, like let's imagine you're a community group and you are all pledging a certain amount of your goods and services for these future tokens that are going to be minted after the signing of this DAO, paper DAO, right? And is there an auditor on that? Does the chief sign? Does the elder sign? Who does mediation? That's all in there. Is there an expiration date? Is there a demurrage? Where do those expired tokens go? Are they destroyed? So designing your token, in other words, like there's a DAO process around that, right? You're signing a contract with a bunch of people. That DAO, that contract can be adjustable in the future, right? With quorum, for instance, how many people have to sign to change something on it, or minting more. Like what's like? Let's say we mint a certain amount, right? Let's say we mint 50,000 tokens against promises, credit obligations of 50,000 shillings of our goods and services, right? And that could be a single organization, or many organizations coming together to do like a mall voucher, and what's the process to mint more in the future? And what's available for the public to consume in terms of all the information? What is the mint process? Who's signed? This is your verified impact claim or verified data, right? By itself. So like we have a lot of processes there that will eventually become DAOified so that anyone can just do this stuff online. But for now, it's just a paper contract. And so this is sort of a step back, though, in a sense, because we are identifying a new value system, right? We're identifying a local, intrinsic, endogenous value, a value from within, right? Those tokens can now be used for another DAO, right? You could start staking them. You could start doing the liquidity pools are another. You could almost think of those as a DAO potentially. You could have oracles on the liquidity pool, adjusting price or relative pricing. There's all kinds of potential stuff to do for them. But I think that's one of the things we found, like in Kenya, there's these things called chamas, which are like groups. Chama means group in Swahili, but there's like village savings and loan associations, or merry-go-rounds, or roscas, or tontines in French-speaking areas, or savings and internal lending cooperatives. There's all these models of cooperatives where they save some money together or something, right? And they have a way of either taking loans out against this or offering it to people within the group. Well, but the fundamental problem isn't about the ledger or signing or anything. It's that they don't have that stuff to put in there. Quite often, that's the main problem they have. They don't have access to credit, right, in any way. And so we go back and say, wait, let's solve that problem, but let's talk about that at least, right? Because, so if you've got a DAO in Oregon or Wyoming that is like, collecting some kind of token or national currency stable token or whatever, wonderful, and you guys can decide how to do that. But that's not your only fucking resource, right? I hope it isn't. If it is, then you're kind of screwed as a whole civilization, right? and so thinking beyond the national currencies and the bitcoins and whatnot that are essentially commodities, they've been captured, but trust can't be captured, right? And that's what's beautiful about the concept of to me about community currency is that it's really talking about trusted systems, not trustless systems. They're actually building on trust. And if I trust you, Brandon, you trust me, we can do so many things together, right? Like what's possible when a group of people come in and start building systems of trust, where it can't be commodified, it's not going to be captured by one person. And that's like the things like the demurrage, for instance, these sort of like expiring tokens, means like it's not valuable to hold on to someone's trust in this sense, right? It needs to move and it needs to circulate. So designing systems are much more around trust and getting away from these designs that are kind of commodity token sort of designs where few people own most of them. It's designed to be centralized and controlled over time. Those can be useful in other ways, but just leaving open this access to credit and really seeing that as an economic liberty concept, like that should be there. And like I think what is the 22nd amendment to the Human Rights Bill of Human Rights, like this idea that there is economic liberty, that people should be free to choose to trade in whatever currency they want, right? And they should be free to make their own currencies. That should be a basic freedom, like just obvious. That should be obvious to everyone. And hopefully in the next few years, that obviousness should overwhelm the legal system. And I mean, we're working right now, like just simply to say, what's the legal right that Brandon Lovejoy has to make vouchers against his bread? And if I buy some of those, or I get some of those for tomatoes, can I now trade them for a banana? Mm-hmm. Is that not a basic human right? And yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, since the beginning of my working with blockchain, I've regarded these transactions as a form of free speech, essentially. And I'm located in the U.S., so I view that sort of economic right as the right of free speech, more or less. And yeah, so I'm wondering, the other day you referenced an article by Robin Wall Kimmerer on the SERVICEBERRY gift economies, which is a great article. And it sounds a lot like, if I'm reading between the lines correctly with you, that you almost want to find a way to use voucher systems and use mutual credit and use things of this nature to like nudge humanity back towards gift economies, towards almost a less formal, non-transactional, reciprocity-based mode of interacting, which is right up my alley.
Yeah, I love that vision. I think that like ultimately, once you develop good systems, the only time you need a fully sort of like fungible currency in terms of like that type of an economic unit is when you're dealing with truly unknown or outsiders. But once you have a really strong system, like if we're on the Star Trek Enterprise together and I'm like, Brandon, turn on the engine, and you're like, you don't have to tell me like, dude, Sulu, I need like 500 Bitcoin to do that. Like, no, like you've got the badge, like we're on a mission, we're doing this thing, Brandon, like what the, right? Yeah. I mean, if that happened, it would break down the Starship Enterprise. Like it just couldn't function in that case, right? So
hold on, I got to wait an hour for the transaction to confirm before I can start the engine.
Yeah. Right. Look, let's go mine some Bitcoin before this happens. Like, no, guys. Like, if we are actually on a mission together, like, there's other types of systems we can use to organize each other, and that's where I think like this stuff around like impact claims and badging and certification like makes a lot of sense, and webs of trust, right? Mm-hmm. Like, Brandon, you've been fucking certified. If you're not going to turn on the engine right now, like, okay. This is going to be a process, like we're going to have to go through some issues right now, but, but if you're making some sort of agreement with like the Romulans or something, maybe you need a commodity token. You need something to establish trust between the Romulans and the Klingons and, right.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, currencies are never, like, I think, especially like, fungible currencies are not going to go away. And ideally they teach us those flows. Like we've been in a lot of communities where they've started using a community currency and they've started establishing flows where they no longer need currency anymore, which is really cool. Where they've just been like, oh, right, there's a path there. There's a cycle. We don't need fucking currency for that anymore. We just do it.
It's
like the currency, that's awesome.
Yeah, the currency piece almost becomes like this superfluous sort of like thing. They're like, wait, why am I doing this when I can just make the exchange with
ideally it's like a dye in the water, right? Like you can actually visualize and see. I love like Art Brock talks about like currencies, like you're seeing a current with a currency, right? And eventually that currency, that flow becomes something that is an infrastructure piece, right? That's just infrastructure, right? The flow of, if lots of examples, but like, the flow from education to food, right? Well, there's a flow there, right? Like the teachers need to eat, right? The students need to get, education. The parents of the teachers make food, right? Like that can be really, really freaking obvious, right? And like the rent of the teachers. And so a lot of these things in these communities that we work with, like, there may be like something like a dozen types of goods and services within the community, and just making those flow amongst each other and creating reciprocal systems is sometimes, like the currency really helps that form. Because what happened was they used to have reciprocal systems, like 100 years ago. And then the British came in and said, look, I'm going to charge you 20 shillings a month to live. It was called the hut tax, right? And if you can't pay it, we're going to fucking put you in jail and you're going to become an indentured servant to us. It was a form of imperialism. And that's what people like don't really, I think, grok is like most like the currency systems we live in today were imperialistic schemes, right? In order to control people, right? We're going to tax you in the money that we only can make, right? Like freaking Bitcoin in El Salvador, right? What bullshit is that, right? Like that's totally just straight up, imperialistic playbook. That's all it is. Why not empower those people to make their own? Why on earth couldn't El Salvador make their own? And link it, make a liquidity pool connected out to Bitcoin if you want to. Like wonderful, right? Like why not empower people? So, I mean, it's frustrating in some ways but I feel like, we're on the cusp. And I think, with humanitarian space and then combined with sort of impact investment and just the concept of, is a currency that is established by, let's say, an upcycling factory, something that is as a utility token? Is it something that is investable? And so getting away from equity and ownership in that sense and getting into holding a share of that production, right? So anyone holding that token is holding a share of that production, right? So you as a user of those services are holding a share of that. And so if I'm an investor now, can I go in and support those systems and get away from these sort of equity models and get into a more sort of fair share model? And what can I do? Well, I could provide a service with that token by connecting it to other tokens. I could be a liquidity provider. I could hold that token and use it to buy impact claims and data from that organization, right? And resell those, like if there's carbon claims that are valuable, right? So if we can create a social impact investment space around these tokens and they form this layer that connects them all together, I think that's the way forward. And that's what we've been doing so far with the humanitarian space. Most of the humanitarian space is moving away from pure, like they went into cash transfer and now they're sort of going into impact investment somehow. There's a lot of that going on. So like, Mercy Corps and UNICEF, they all have impact investment kind of arms now where they're sort of saying like, well, how do we stay, actually have a stake in these services long term, that we're part of them rather than dumping money and walking away, right? And the same with impact investors. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you worry? I like that you can see when I'm having a thought now. Do you worry that with a lot of the impact investment space, do you worry about agenda-driven giving as kind of harkening back to this like colonial sort of developmental agendas, and how is that? How can these systems kind of circumvent even that, and how do we avoid the pitfall of receiving funds for different systems that kind of just groom a population to be like better consumers in a new, neo-colonial paradigm?
Yeah. Well, okay, so I mean, I like getting away from equity in general. So I think that there's positive stuff around that, and there's also positive stuff around sort of divestment, right? So if we're taking these old form assets of trustafarians and whatnot who got their money somehow by happening to own land over generations and yada yada, there's all this kind of like generational wealth. If we can say, can that be invested into creating local utility and service, right? Service-based models, and by investing it in this, are you also providing a service by connecting it into other stuff? And so I think there has to be some sort of divestment from a lot of these holdings of these old kind of commodity systems, and ideally building infrastructure layers, right? That's building bootstraps so that many groups can flourish and start building those tokens without even needing that either, right? But if somehow it actually creates, oh cool man, thanks, that's something. If it creates a space where that's possible, I think it's super positive. And like there's in some areas, like if you're in the middle of France and you're using like Jeun or one of these like UBI tokens, or you've created your own network space, and you guys are in a way privileged enough to be able to farm and eat your own food, and you can actually create your own earthship or whatever, and do that stuff, like amazing. And we want to build the infrastructure so everyone can do that, right? And so if we can divest a lot of these funds, these impact investor funds into that infrastructure, then we can build those systems up. And I haven't waited for that to happen. I've just done it. With Grassroots Economics, we've just gone into communities and said, okay, you can do these things, but that's us. We are still bootstrapping. We're impact investing in that case, right? We're going into those communities and saying, we believe in this. We're taking funds from donors quite often, saying we're paying for the USSD costs with the the telecom company, right? For instance, right? So I think it's a really important space, and I think that like impact investors and humanitarians, thinking in the terms of impact investment can do so much good, and they can actually see it happening as well, right? Like really get data from what they're investing into is a huge thing, and that goes. I there's a real gray line between ESG investors versus humanitarian organizations nowadays, where they're really both trying to environment, sustainability, and governance. It's there's a lot of these sort of impact investment modalities out there where you have like curation as well as part of this. So people are going in and saying, I want to curate this portfolio of green companies, for instance, and things like that. So I think there's very few companies in the world, percentage-wise, that you can actually invest in a traditional sense, right? But if this opens up the realm to saying, well, I can actually, instead of investing equity in these companies, I can have whole portfolios of ISPs or vegan restaurants that I can support as a portfolio, that or youth-led organizations. Well, that's something, and have data on it all, right? And have impact claims and verified proofs of these services happening. I think it's just opening up that Web3 world, right, where people can be part of the systems that they're supporting.
Where do you see grassroots economics headed over the next decade? What's your hope for the work you're doing?
Yeah, I hope that we're holding some kernel space, that is useful around the tech and best practices and standards in this, and we're just still, working on examples and consulting with organizations that want to do these things, and just offering, being of service to this space. We're trying to make the space grow, and people to really understand it, and hopefully it's everything we do should be forked and copied a million different ways. And if we're still useful, people will be like, hey, Will, what happens if what happens if the company issuing these vouchers goes bankrupt or goes under? How do we protect against that? And we say, oh, here's the legal design that we've developed around that, and here's the, we're working with, all the, legal due diligence and all that kind of stuff needs to be open source. There can't be IP, behind any of this stuff. So if we're able to hold that space and be useful in it, and then, customizing the code, and, you want a different wallet for a time bank in Hong Kong or something like this, there's a great group out there called Shanghai City that's doing a lot of really interesting work with time banks out there that we really love. So there's a lot of, like, hopefully there's a grassroots in every country. I mean, not actually grassroots, but doing this type of work, right? Where this just becomes a normal thing. And then, so maybe to some degree there'll be like, there's Linux Foundation, and then there's Red Hat and Ubuntu and all these kind of, other flavors and stuff like this. And, whether or not we're a Linux Foundation, which is much more massive than we're hoping to scale. But, if there's a piece that we can hold, that's wonderful. And, for me, I'd like to, write more children's books around the concept of currency, and have a paddleboard in the mangroves, and just, be on a river and watch my daughter grow up, and just, and be of service, and just, be happy, and never get rich, only rich in my heart. Yeah.
Those are great aspirations. That's great. It's hard to top that, especially the paddleboard in the mangroves. Sounds very appealing.
Yeah,
and watching your children grow up in a world where they can imagine something besides what we've been sort of baked into as recipients of this economic order that is, largely seen to be outside of our control or our ability to create. We're like very downstream from that, so it feels good. I'm glad that you're working in the space and pioneering these other ways, other modalities of interacting with value and community. And I had a question there somewhere, but I'm trying to tease it back out of my brain.
You had mentioned this thing about the gift economy, and to some degree, there's this state, like we talked about, like the enterprise, where we're on a mission together and whatnot. But there's even before that, and this is sort of what bridged from these older kind of mutual credit systems, where like trust lines or something like this, where I do something for you, and you give me 10 tokens, and then I'm negative 10 tokens, right? Where we create money sort of on the fly. And you hear this, it's very popularized even the last 50 years with like Let's and all these kind of systems like this. And those it's like popcorn, it's like a matter antimatter, it's like we create matter antimatter, then the net, it's net zero, all the time, and that sort of thing, which is fine and wonderful. But what people miss in a lot of these systems is the ability to really plan toward the future. And what we've been doing a lot, and what we've moved a lot towards, especially in rural areas, is doing this stuff called Syntropic Agroforestry. And it's regenerative agriculture work. It's pretty labor intensive, but it makes really amazing soil quality, and it sequesters carbon. You can grow, all year if done well, instead of just waiting for seasonal rains and that sort of stuff. Like you're building biomass under the soil. You're creating, root systems and mycorrhizal fungi. That's all, this massive connected root masses and stuff like that. So in order to make that happen, right, and we need millions of people doing this type of work if we really want to change a lot of the, issues going on with food insecurity and climate crisis, right? Well, how do we get all these people to work like this? Right? If they can create a credit against their future production and use it to pay for them living right now, that is the bootstrap to create a lot of this stuff happening. So I feel like a lot of the community currency space is in this sort of popcorn money modality, this matter antimatter, and not thinking, oh wait, no, we need to fucking employ millions of people to do massive regenerative agriculture. right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's very hard to happen with popcorn money, right? Like, how does that really work? Because the value created might be taking years into the future, right? So how do we plan a credit that's not going to be viable for years, right? Maybe it's a credit against the plants that are, or the maybe trees and all kinds of, the biosystem diversity and carbon sequestration that you may not be able to get for years. How do we plan that right now? And so there's a really strong piece that I feel like has been missing in a lot of the community currency space, and that has been planning massive programs or planning into the future. Like we talked about, like your bread shop, right? You're going to create a voucher against your future bread after you build your next, or maybe your last one burnt down or something. I mean, you need to build a new one. You don't really do that with popcorn money. It doesn't make sense, like it's very hard to actually plan into the future. And so this gets into this idea that, vouchers or, promissory notes into the future, these credit obligations are very much real and powerful intentionalities and manifestations that we miss in a lot of these mutual credit kind of like trust lines-esque systems. It's really hard to have a group come together and do that. So, so this thing about, back to sort of like the gift economy, if I have this future vision of this farm that are, could be produced into the future, and I want to create a credit against that future vision and say, look, guys, I want to make this happen. I want all of you to take part in it. I'm going to give you a share of that vision, right? And we're all going to work together towards that vision. That's super powerful. That's really an amazing thing that's possible. And that's, what gave birth to, like, access to credit gave birth to, like, the Industrial Revolution, for instance, right? It was even like the all shipping industries. There's a huge amount of trust involved in these, and they built contracts, like really hardcore fucking contracts, like, like all these old like nautical contracts are fucking amazing. And they created entire industries and systems around it, right? We need to basically re-own that space. And it's about trust. It's about, real contracts. It's about, making sure that people are somehow obligated to fulfill those contracts. There can be forgiveness. There can be all kinds of systems around it as well. But I just, I think with the gift economy space, and even the mutual credit space, it's, like for us to really plan for the future, it takes, this sharing of our future potential and to really identify it together. So it's like we are gifting each other. We're still doing this sort of mutual credit. We're just doing it in a way that is a little bit more directed toward conscious future projects, rather than, yeah, he's got some berries, I got some berries, I'm going to trade you some berries for some back rubs. Okay, great, we're done. Like that's most of the mutual credit systems in the last 50 years have been fucking back rubs and gooseberries, and like that's great. I love back rubs and gooseberries.
Yeah.
But how do we make the next cooperative or Syntropic? How do we turn the Sahara into, a thriving green zone for the planet instead of a massive hole that it is right now? I mean, God, yeah, there's a lot of need for massive projects, and I don't see the current funding mechanisms being viable for those right now, right? How do we create massive reforestation projects right now if we're waiting for national currency to fulfill those, right? Or Bitcoin or any of these sort of commodified tokens? It's going to be super hard. So like coming up with that kind of stuff, I think we just need to be creative and explore that space more. And like things like regen.network, they're doing amazing work around, again, these sort of impact claims against carbon sequestration, creating markets for those and whatnot. And so, imagine you've got a currency that's against your future production on that land, but at the same time, that land is accruing carbon credits, right? So you can eat off the land while carbon credits are accruing, right? And so, so again, it's just bootstrapping. How do we bootstrap these systems? How do we create trust?
Yeah, you introduced the time element, which is so critical. I've spent a little time with Lakota and Pine Ridge, and that's an area that I'm interested in seeing. A lot of work needs to be done there, and there's an organization called Ulseri that is working on food and housing security. And a lot of what you're talking about would be super applicable to the work that they're doing. It's a very difficult space to bootstrap, having itself been downstream of, a few hundred years of ruin, colonial ruin.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's one piece that I've kind of gotten from them is the 300, 300, 7 generations, 7 tenants, and 300 years out is kind of the view that they take. And it seems like a really important piece to try and Charles Eisenstein also talks a little bit about this with in his writings recently in his book Sacred Economics, which I'm kind of guessing you're familiar with.
Yeah, love it.
Yeah, the idea of using, he's like, well, if we back our money with unspoiled resources, like a forest that is, like the Amazon, if we backed our money with the Amazon, unextracted, untouched, like we tend to protect and preserve what we back our money with. So, also thinking of more like in a manifesting the system or manifesting the space that we want in the future, like you're talking about now, by issuing credit against like a future desired outcome, which could be an intact ecosystem or earthworks or human systems that are light on the land. It's a really inspiring line of thinking. How do you think we bootstrap these? How do we deliver it's really just like ideas, more than, I think you and I see a lot of the technology around it as kind of provisional and only necessary to a certain point. How do we break the spell? How do we introduce these other ways, other modes of transacting and visioning future with these credit systems? Is it just a matter of education, or is there some viral toolkit waiting to be released upon the world that will make it spread like wildfire?
I'm hoping so. I like in the U.S., for instance, if let's say we're on Pine Ridge, and I used to work there with Engineers Without Borders.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And let's say that there's a solar farm coming up, for instance. That's what we were trying to work on back then. I don't know. I actually don't even know if it ever got built. We were just doing the designs for it, and if the idea was that we're going to, in order to raise the funds for this, first off, we're going to pre-sell a lot of this electricity, right? Well, can we sell that? Can we create vouchers against that electricity, right? So we have a vision of something that we want to build, a resource and infrastructure. Can we raise funds in that way by pre-selling some of that, the actual utility token for that infrastructure, right? It's as simple as like the old sort of ICO concept, but instead of it being an ICO against a speculative asset, it's an ICO against a utility token, right? If that can become a normal practice, and those tokens can then be connected out into other markets, and we can get investment around those types of things, I think that's a really, really powerful way to give ownership to everyone who's using that utility, as well as to get investment into those spaces as well. So I think just practically for people to understand, and groups and communities to say, or even municipalities to say, we're going to create a credit against our future, the services in our community and tax revenue and whatnot, right? We're going to tax that. We can use it as a basic income, right? There's so much utility, and we're going to allow people to invest and stake into this space, right? I think it can be extremely practical and useful, and ideally we completely avoid any issues with the SEC and those kinds of things, right? Because it's just really establishing actual utilities, with these. So I want to see people using that concept and that model, and us to have tools that make it fucking super easy for people to come out and say, yeah, we're making a token for in inner city Chicago against the future rent of these buildings that are coming up to help people that are just getting out of jail, right? So we're gonna house people that are getting out of jail, and we're gonna pre-sell the rental income in order to build these houses. And we're going to make a token that connects out to the bakeries and all this, rehab clinics and, whatever that needs to be in that space. And we create environments and ecosystems about it. I don't think it's actually that complicated. I just think we need a lot more practical examples of it working. And I feel like, for 10 years or so, we've been doing this in Kenya, just practically going to a village and saying, you've got this potential. You know what it is. Let's create a credit against it, right? And let's share that and make it real, right? That's it. I don't think it, so a lot of the tech and stuff like this, yes, we need easy to use and packageable and bundled things. But, again, like try to stay, as agnostic as you can on the tech. But what's nice about a lot of this tech, and especially like in the Cosmos space, for instance, I mentioned, is that it's easy to bridge from ecosystem to ecosystem. Don't get stuck on Cello, for instance, right? If everything, don't get stuck on Stellar, make sure that there's bridges, make sure that you're as independent as possible. And so that's, for us designing a lot of this software for, the humanitarian space, we need to make sure, because we've had to jump blockchains twice to get away from extractive gas. We got in, it was the golden doors open, say, oh, come into our blockchain. It's so cheap. It's so cheap. Like within 5 months, it's 5x the gas cost every single time. And we've had to jump. And so there's a lot of that crap, constantly in this space. And so the tech is important when we need people that understand that this is infrastructure, and that, if like in the humanitarian space, we, for us on XDAI, for instance, they were going to charge us $20,000 to now run a node on XDAI. We just didn't have the money, right? And all of a sudden the gas fees are starting to go up and up and up, and we're like, oh shit, what do we do? So we found another blockchain called Bloxburg, where it's run by a bunch of universities, and it's free for us to use, but we also can't run a node there because we're not a university, right? So there's a lot of these kind of catch-22s of like, how do we be part of the space that we're trying to create? And so, we've been very much looking at how can we make sure that we're on a blockchain where we are going to always be able to pay the gas for the marginalized communities that we're working with. So I think answering that question is a big deal right now, and I hope in the next even few months that we have some potential answers for that. I mean, there's a lot that can be done. I mean, even like proof of authority type chains where it's like voted on, where like Red Cross runs a node and Mercy Corps and the UN runs a node. Like there's a lot of potential around even just small blockchains that are run on mesh networks and things like that. So that's a lot of the space we're working on as well. So yes, we want that viral SDK / humanitarian ledger system. Even if it's a Lightning chain on Bitcoin that enables some of this stuff to happen, we need a humanitarian ledger that we can all create our value systems on. Right. And we need it to be censor proof. We need it to be, zero knowledge proof, like anonymous. I don't want it to be tracked at all unless I don't want you to even be able to look up, my wallet address and see my transactions unless I decide you can do that, right? Like, totally protected. Like, so there's a lot of features around this stuff, like social recovery. I should be able to automatically have contracts that say my mom can unlock my key if I ever lose it, yada, yada, all that kind of stuff. Like, we're still not there yet. We should have been there a long time ago, I feel like, but we're trying. I mean, the whole space, I feel like, is starting to converge on these concepts. The Interchain Foundation is starting to do a lot of work on this stuff. I mean, virtually every blockchain out there, from Cardano to Stellar to all these guys have been smelling the roses of community currencies, right? And being like, oh wait, right, or like Cello, like we would love to get tons of people around the world to use our blockchain for this, because of course it would make them a lot of money in the end. And at the same time, there's humanitarian sector and a lot of these blockchain folks who say, well, actually, maybe it's not about getting them trapped onto our rent-seeking system. Instead, it's about enabling them to create their own systems and just connecting them together. or creating systems that are never going to go, to the moon in their gas prices. And if you think about a gas token, it's just another voucher, right? It's a voucher against block validation, right? Well, if you just have a very honest utility voucher for that, the cost should never really go up that much. It shouldn't be a speculative thing as it is right now. Just like a voucher for haircuts or, Lovejoy bread, you could speculate on Lovejoy bread, but, come on, it's not going to go 16,000%, or it never should. And so getting real about the value of gas gas prices and things like this on blockchain, I'm looking forward to as well. Yeah.
Yeah, the speculation in the space is a little out of hand and can be creating kind of unnecessary inflation in certain areas of value.
Yeah, it's just a lot of just pump and dump stuff going on. I mean, it's just huge, it's just, again, laser eyes.
And the proof of authority concept is very interesting. And yeah, a lot of these ideas that you say, are noble goals to work towards in terms of blockchain technology, like anonymity and this other, it's super difficult to solve all those problems simultaneously, like low cost transactions, anonymous, but verified identity in some sense, so the network knows it's dealing with a unique, individual, and
webs
of trust and recovery of keys, and
but all those pieces are there. They're definitely within the space now. It's packaging it all together and making good SDKs around all this stuff, and there's definitely getting to be like an army of devs and programmers around those concepts that they can sort of see that future vision of what's possible in that space, and start building towards that rather than, these sort of, walled gardens and rent-seeking systems. Yeah.
I think you'll like what comes out of Clarion OS, which is intended to be it's sort of not even really. It's micro blockchains, like many people, definitely like a peer-to-peer network rather than any centralized services in the middle and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of potential there. Anonymity, I'm not sure. That's a tricky one. But yeah, we'll get there. Well, I feel like we're an hour and 27 in, and this has been a really awesome conversation. I'm pretty sure we could do this 3 more times and still have things to talk about.
Totally.
Yeah, you're a wealth of information. I'm gonna study up more on grassroots economics, and yeah, I could ask you a ton of questions about, like, I really want to pick your brain about how to implement some things in low tech, low connectivity environments like Pine Ridge and other places, but maybe we'll save that for another time.
Cool.
And yeah, thanks so much for being here, and it was nice to watch the sunset behind you while I'm still like just getting into my day.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'd love to come out to Kenya sometime and see what it's like on the ground there, and go to the ocean, see those mangroves.
Totally. You got to come out, escape the bubble a little bit too. Of that part of the world, I think it's super important for people. Yeah, exactly. It's a beautiful place there. I do miss it every once in a while, but it's just, today just floating down a creek because the tide brings you in up the, in the mangroves, watching the birds, and it's just it's so beautiful to be out here, and also just working with communities that need a lot of support, but at the same time have so much wealth and resources and tradition that I feel like I learn more from them than they ever learned from me. And it's just a matter of like tapping into a lot of cultural systems and tools that they already have and or had and are going back to now. That's super powerful. So I think, being out here and just learning from that environment is really beautiful. Yeah. So Caribou, yeah, you're very welcome, and bring other people out as well, and yeah,
awesome. Yeah, I escape into the wilderness as often as I can, and get away from the the grid. So, and I've spent a little time in South Africa, which I loved at the time, but I've never made it that far up to be in Kenya. So really looking forward to that. Well, thanks so much for your time, and
Thanks for having me.
let's do it again when the time is right.